Marin saw the body before she heard the siren, a small shape on the wet pavement, the city's lights folding over it like a slow, indifferent blink. The air tasted of metal and rain and a dread that settled in her chest like an unwelcome promise. Someone had used a kind of cruelty that left no headline and no easy answer. Just a silence that felt deliberate, as if the street itself had turned away. She crouched without thinking, fingers numb, and felt a pulse she couldn't read because it wasn't hers to read. The world narrowed to the ragged sound of someone's breath and the rhythm of her own panic. She thought of experiments she'd read about in college, those infamous studies that suggested ordinary people could be pushed to monstrous behavior under certain pressures. Now the theory felt less academic and more like a map she had to navigate blind. Her hands trembled as she touched the fallen person's wrist, warm, fading. Not dead yet, but close enough that a decision leaned on her like weather. The nearest hospital was 20 minutes away if she called, and 20 minutes was a kind of currency she suddenly couldn't afford. The street smelled of damp paper and exhaust. There was an envelope beside the man's hand, its flap torn, a stamp smeared by rain in a way that made the postmark useless. Whoever had left it there had done it quickly, with hands that had rehearsed the motion. Marin's breath made small clouds in the air. She took the envelope because the dead or dying leave traces that sometimes contain explanation, and Marin had always been the kind of person who looked for explanations like a lifeline. The envelope held a photograph, and for a moment she forgot to breathe. The photograph showed a child with a gap-toothed grin and hair like spun wheat. There was an intimacy in the picture that seemed to press into Marin's chest. The child looked at the camera with the sort of blunt trust that made her throat ache. Marin had her own photograph tucked in a drawer, a different life, softer edges, but this picture felt invasive in a way that demanded attention. The rains had not yet finished. A bead rolled down the paper and blurred a corner of the image into a watercolor smear. It was small and human and unbearable. The siren's wail arrived then, long and keening, and Marin stepped back as the first responders huddled the scene with professional choreography. She let the professionals take over, but she kept her hands near the envelope as if it might float away. The paramedics' questions were efficient and gentle. "Were you with him? Did you see anyone?" Each one a probe into the small area of truth she had occupied. Marin answered with the cautious honesty of someone wanting to be useful but not central. The policeman taking notes had an expression of practiced distance. He wrote in a book as if writing down events could chain them into reason. When the crowd dispersed, Marin walked home with the photograph folded in the pocket of her coat like contraband. Her apartment smelled of coffee and the faint lemon of the detergent she used on stubborn days to convince herself life could be organized. She turned the picture over in her hands and tried to imagine how a child's unguarded smile could be attached to an act of violence. The gap between the two felt like a puzzle where half the pieces had been ground to dust. Sleep did not come. Marin lay awake and thought about small, accumulating cruelties, a phrase she de-learned in a psychology seminar and never expected to apply to her own life. Small omissions, tiny betrayals, a refusal to look at a person in need. The studies that mapped such behaviors often used controlled conditions and ethical arguments, but in the dark of her bedroom those frameworks felt like brittle scaffolding. She wondered what her small omissions had cost others over the years. How many times she had stepped aside to avoid discomfort and thereby allowed another person as danger to pass unchecked. Memory offered scenes like film reels, a bus stop where she had avoided eye contact with a man muttering to himself, a hallway where she had swallowed a gasp and walked past a coworker crying alone in the break room. Each image made the knot in her stomach tighter. She feared that horror did not always announce itself with dramatic punctuation. More often, it crept along a long, quiet seam of neglect. The research she had once found thrilling about how social pressures and situational variables could alter behavior now felt like a ledger she had neglected to balance. The next morning she went back to the street because there was a voice in her that required her to see what remained when the crowd was gone. Yellow tape fluttered lightly where the city's rhythm resumed. The paper cup that had been kicked away had returned to its place like a guilty thing. The envelope, taken as evidence, left only a shadow on the curb. She traced the line of where the body had lain and tried to imagine what invisible forces had guided the choices that night. Sometimes the mind reconstructs sign as a series of logical steps. Other times it refuses to be tidy. Marin started to keep a notebook. She wrote observations like a scientist and confessions like someone trying to name ghosts. Her entries were not neat. They were jagged, human, and full of questions. She wrote about the photograph and about a child's grin that had lodged of its own volition inside her ribs. She wrote about the paramedic's tired eyes and the policeman's neat sentences. Mostly she wrote lists of what she might have done differently, and the lists were a kind of therapy that did not always heal. A week passed that felt like a small expanding universe. Marin found the story on a local news feed. An anonymous man. Attacked late at night, an investigation ongoing, and the photograph cropped into a grainy square beneath the headline. Comments bloomed in predictable anger and speculation. Many assumed the worst. Fewer asked why someone had walked past and what had made silence feel safe. Marin kept her own counsel and the notebook under her pillow. At times she imagined the child in the photograph as a talisman, a small counterweight against the slippery suggestion that people were only what they chose in a single hour. She started to read differently. Psychology papers, older case studies, books that traced how social context and moral fractures could bend a person into violence. Her reading wasn't clinical anymore. It had the urgency of a person trying to apply theory to flesh. She questioned where empathy had been eroded in the scenes she had found and in others she de-witnessed. She began to look at faces in crowds with a more careful gaze, attempting to detect the tiny fissures of fear or shame. Sometimes she felt like a scientist in a moral lab, other times like someone who had been awakened to a danger that had always been waiting quietly. Most nights she dreamed in fragments, a child's laugh cut off, a hand slipping away, a city that looked the same and was suddenly an unfamiliar geography. The dreams left her with a sticky residue of unease that made the next day longer. She tried to talk to a friend about the incident, but found the words clumsy and inadequate. The friend offered sympathy and moved on, and Marin realized that grief and guilt do not always map neatly for others. Loneliness arrived in small measures, like a room filling with fog. Marin knew she was changing. It was nothing dramatic at first. Small shifts in how she answered a knock, whom she chose to help, but the shifts accumulated until her reflexes felt altered. She did not yet know what this alteration meant. She only knew that the photograph in her drawer looked at her with a kind of patient accusation, and that the city had grown sharper-edged in ways she couldn't ignore. Marin woke to morning light and a memory that refused to dissolve. The child's grin like a key turned in a lock. She made coffee and tried to anchor a mind that spun too fast. Outside, the city carried on with its small betrayals, honking, meetings, impatience, and Marin felt like an intruder in a world that had not learned the language she now needed to speak. Her notebook had become a ledger. Each entry listed time, weather, and the larger thoughts she circled. She had rehearsed explanations for why she had stayed near the man that night. Fear, uncertainty, the idea someone else had called. Rehearsed reasons felt like paper armor. They folded when pressed. Marin realized she had grown practiced at excusing inaction. In the second week, she noticed a pattern. Incidents on the same stretch where she had found the man. Petty thefts, a couple of assaults, a disappearance the news called under investigation and then forgot. Marin's curiosity tightened into focus. She began to map the incidents, marking times and brief descriptions. Patterns can be seductive. They can also point to danger. At the library, she read old articles and learned the language detectives used to mask uncertainty. She spoke to a retired social worker named Lyle, whose bluntness Marin found comforting. "When people stop noticing each other, things happen," he said. Marin turned words into action. She began volunteering at a shelter 3 nights a week, not to absolve herself, but to learn the tongues of people on the margins. Stories arrived in fragments, names misremembered, timelines that contradicted, little triumphs swallowed by long days. Marin listened more than she spoke. Listening taught her how pain is often disguised as ordinary detail. There she met Elena, whose jaw held the memory of too many closed doors. Elena laughed in sudden bursts, as if joy had to prove itself twice. They began with small exchanges, a cigarette behind the building, a sandwich split, and Marin found Elena's presence both ache and balm. Elena mentioned a man who lingered at bus stops. Marin had learned to take nothing as a clue. The man in the green coat became a cipher. Marin noticed him near the strip where incidents clustered. Patient gait, hands tucked, face often turned away. She jotted observations, times, locations, the sound of his shoes. What began as citizen curiosity became obsession, a private investigation fed by guilt and a desire to prevent repetition. She asked neighbors under the pretense of small talk. People gave non-committal answers, but a few offered more, A night worker felt watched. A teenager mentioned a man who paced with dusk. Each testimony was a thread. Marin wove them into a tentative pattern and felt both foolish and driven. Her friend Jonah noticed a change. Over coffee, he said, "Promise me you'll be careful." Marin nodded. She was beginning to feel the small power that comes from assembling scraps into knowledge. One evening, under a sky smelling faintly of rain, Marin followed the man from a distance. He paused outside a boarded storefront and touched a loose brick as if it were routine. Marin's heart drummed with a mix of dread and absurdity. She wished for a badge and felt ridiculous without one. She took a picture and taped it into her notebook. For the first time she saw his face clearly, ordinary, forgettable. The ordinariness tightened something inside her like an overused muscle. She thought of studies that argued ordinary people could commit monstrous acts. Seeing this man, she understood how ordinariness could be dangerous camouflage. At the shelter, Alina spoke of a neighbor's boy who had stopped coming around, of small kindnesses withdrawn until a life tilted. Marin learned to identify tiny ruptures that preceded catastrophe, missed calls, unexplained bruises, reluctance to meet a gaze. These were not dramatic signs. They were subtle erosions that, if unattended, allowed harm to grow. Marin began to act differently. She accompanied Alina on errands, walked older neighbors to the store, called numbers on flyers, reported suspicious behavior to a city outreach line. Small interventions did not erase guilt, but they built persistence. The work felt like learning a new language, how to ask without accusing, how to offer presence without overwhelming. One night she found a scrap of fabric snagged on a fence near the strip. It matched the green coat. Marin put it in a plastic bag and took it to Lyle, who suggested she hand evidence to the police. Marin hesitated, but left the bag at the precinct with a note explaining where she'd found it. Detective Reyes accepted the bag. She looked at Marin with a mix of skepticism and gratitude. "You did the right thing," Reyes said. She asked unexpected questions. "Did you see anything else? Videos? Names?" Marin answered honestly, feeling exposed but emboldened. Reyes promised to follow up. In the days that followed, Marin watched the strip with new eyes, aware that official interest had shifted the geometry of danger. She kept volunteering and watching people with a softer vigilance. Her avoidance of pain had been replaced by a compulsion to intervene, and the compulsion felt like a bridge between guilt and purpose. The city did not resolve overnight. Incidents continued. But Marin felt herself changing into someone who could not pass a person in need without pausing. The psychology she'd read as theory was now a set of practices: noticing, asking, staying. She did not know if she would find a neat end to the pattern she had traced, but she had learned to tolerate uncertainty with action. As the week folded, Marin closed her notebook and tucked it into her coat. She stepped into the street with a steadiness that wasn't courage so much as refusal to return to ignorance. The man in the green coat remained a shadow in her mind, a question that had become a mission. She had chosen to look, and looking demanded consequence. Marin's hands trembled slightly as she slid her notebook across the cafe table toward Detective Reyes. The detective's eyes scanned the pages with that calm, methodical patience of someone accustomed to walking through other people's storms. Marin hated how exposed she felt under that gaze. Every timestamp, every name, every drawn arrow suddenly looked childish, like a game of connect the dots that might mean nothing. Reyes set the notebook down and said, "You've done more than some witnesses ever do, but you need to be careful. People who stir sleeping dogs often find they wake up something worse." The warning rattled Marin more than she let on. She nodded and wrapped her fingers around the chipped coffee mug as if it could anchor her. She wondered if curiosity always came with danger, or if danger was born out of not looking away. That night the rain returned, a slow drizzle that slicked the streets in silver. Marin walked home, head down, remembering the first night she'd found the man lying on the pavement. The photo of the child was still tucked safely in her drawer at home. She had started to think of that child as the silent witness to everything she was doing. At the shelter, Alina noticed the change in Marin's face. "You look like you've been somewhere else for days," she said, her voice soft but edged with concern. Marin smiled faintly. "Just thinking about patterns. Patterns don't save people," Alina replied. "Being there does." The words stayed with Marin long after her volunteer shift ended. Maybe her obsession with the man in the green coat was just another pattern, another abstraction. But the stories she'd heard at the shelter about people disappearing between one day and the next told her that sometimes the pattern was the only thing that warned you before it was too late. 2 nights later, Marin saw him again. The man in the green coat stood beneath the flickering streetlight near the abandoned bus depot. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat as if urging him to move on. Marin kept her distance, her phone in her pocket, thumb hovering over the camera. He seemed to be waiting. A bus never came. The streets were nearly empty. After 10 minutes, he turned and started walking in the direction of the river. Marin followed as quietly as she could, every step an argument between fear and resolve. He stopped at a chain-link fence and crouched, fumbling with something in the dark. Marin felt her pulse pounding in her ears. A car passed and the headlights swept briefly across his face. He looked ordinary, but she thought she saw the glint of metal in his hand. She ducked behind a dumpster and raised her phone to take a picture. The man straightened abruptly and glanced back. For a moment, their eyes met across the damp night air. Marin's breath caught. Then he turned and vanished into the narrow alley beside the fence. Marin waited until she was sure he was gone before creeping forward. At the base of the fence lay a small stuffed rabbit, its ears matted and dirty from the rain. It looked out of place, like a memory discarded in the wrong neighborhood. She picked it up carefully, her hands trembling. The rabbit's button eye was missing. A name was stitched on its side in faded thread. Ellie. Back in her apartment, Marin set the rabbit on the table beside the photograph of the child. The sight of them together, the grin in the photo and the damp, lost toy, made her chest ache. She flipped open her notebook and began writing down everything: the time, the place, the way his shoulders had hunched as if shielding something from view. The next morning she brought the rabbit to Reyes at the precinct. The detective examined it in silence. "You realize," Reyes said finally, "this could mean nothing. Or it could mean everything." "I know," Marin replied. "But I had to bring it." Reyes looked at her for a long moment. "You're not wrong to be paying attention. But I need you to promise you won't put yourself in danger. We don't know what he's capable of." Marin thought of the rabbit, the photograph, the first night's fading pulse. "I'm not sure I can promise that," she admitted. Reyes sighed. "Then at least promise me you'll call if you see him again." Marin nodded. It was the closest she could come to a promise. That night she dreamed again of the child running barefoot across wet pavement, the rabbit dragging behind by one torn ear. The dream shifted into the alley with the chain-link fence. She woke up sweating, the image of the man's eyes locked in her mind. At the shelter the following evening, Alina noticed the dark circles under Marin's eyes. "You're carrying this alone," Alina said quietly as they sorted donated clothes. "That's how the dark wins, by making you think you can't share the weight." Marin wanted to tell her about the man in the green coat, about the rabbit, about the sense of something moving in the city's shadows. But the words stayed trapped behind her teeth. Later that week, another headline appeared online: "Local teen missing after leaving shelter." The photo showed a boy with shy eyes and a crooked smile. Marin recognized him. He had been at the shelter only 2 nights before, asking if they had a spare blanket. Her stomach clenched. She printed the article and taped it into her notebook beside the rabbit's photo. She began to believe the pattern was not just a theory, but a map of harm waiting to be drawn in full. For the first time, she felt the weight of fear settle into her chest, not for herself, but for others. She had crossed the line between witness and participant. The child's grin in the photo no longer felt like a memory. It felt like a warning. She sat in her small kitchen that night, the city humming beyond her window, and thought about the way evil often hides in plain sight, not in monsters from stories, but in ordinary figures under streetlights, in moments when no one is watching. She wondered if she was ready to keep watching, even as the cost mounted. The notebook lay open beside her coffee cup. The last line she wrote before finally closing it read, "Curiosity is dangerous, but silence is worse." The city moved on as if nothing had changed, but for Marin, the streets had become a living map of dread. Every intersection was marked by memory. The bus depot where she had seen him wait for nothing, the alley where the rabbit lay, the shelter where the missing teen once asked for a blanket. The ordinary world had turned into a pattern of absences, and Marin felt as if she was always walking along the edges of a story that refused to end. Detective Reyes called her one afternoon. The detective's voice was steady, but Marin could hear the tired weight in it. "We found traces of fibers on that rabbit," Reyes said. "We're testing it now. We also have camera footage. A figure in a green coat near the shelter the night the boy disappeared. No clear face. But it's something. Marin closed her eyes for a moment, relief and fear wrestling inside her. Does that mean you'll bring him in? She asked. Not yet, Reyes replied. We need more. I'm telling you this because you deserve to know your instincts weren't wrong. But please, Marin, stay out of the streets at night. Don't follow him again. The warning sat heavy in Marin's chest. She wanted to believe that being careful meant being safe, but her mind kept circling back to the missing boy, to the child in the photo, to the way people disappeared into silence. That night, Marin stayed at the shelter past closing to help clean up. Alina worked beside her, folding blankets, her eyes downcast. The room smelled of detergent and damp wool. Sometimes I think about leaving the city, Alina said suddenly. It's like the streets here swallow people whole. I don't want to be next. Marin looked at her and felt a surge of protectiveness. We can't leave yet, she said softly. Not until we understand what's happening. Alina gave her a strange, small smile. You sound like someone in a movie who goes back into the haunted house. Marin smiled back, though it didn't reach her eyes. Maybe, but someone has to look. As they locked up for the night, Marin noticed a small shape sitting on the steps outside the shelter, a girl no older than 12, shivering under an oversized hoodie. Marin crouched down. Hey, she said gently, are you lost? The girl flinched at her voice but didn't run. I'm just waiting, she whispered. Waiting for who? Marin asked. The girl hesitated, then said, a man who promised to help me. He said he'd bring me food. Marin's heart tightened. What did he look like? The girl shrugged. Tall, green jacket. Said he knew a place to stay. Alina had come closer, her eyes sharp with concern. You don't have to wait for him, she told the girl. Come inside. We have food and a warm place. The girl hesitated again, then let them lead her in. Marin felt the weight of the child's small, cold hand in hers and thought of the photo in her drawer. Once the girl was settled with a blanket and a sandwich, Marin stepped into the hallway to call Reyes. The detective answered on the second ring. Marin told her everything. The girl, the promise, the green jacket. Reyes's voice hardened. Keep her inside. I'm sending someone right now. By the time the officers arrived, the girl had fallen asleep curled on a cot, clutching the blanket as if it might vanish. Marin watched the officers quietly exchange words with Alina, then with her. Was she hurt? One officer asked. No, Marin replied. Just scared. The officer nodded and said they would speak with the girl in the morning. For now, she was safe. Later that night, Marin walked home alone through streets slick with mist. She felt a chill, not just from the air, but from the sense of being watched. She kept her pace steady, her eyes on the sidewalk, and her thoughts on the girl sleeping back at the shelter. When she reached her apartment, she opened her notebook and taped a small drawing the girl had left behind, a crude sketch of a tall man under a streetlight. His coat was scribbled in dark green crayon. The next few days passed in a strange mixture of hope and unease. The girl stayed at the shelter, wary but calmer. Marin visited her often, offering gentle conversation. Slowly, the girl revealed bits of her story, how she'd run from home, how the man had found her at the bus stop, how he promised things that sounded too good to be true. Marin listened without interrupting. Each detail was another thread in the web she was trying to trace. She reported everything to Reyes, who thanked her but reminded her again to be careful. One evening, as Marin walked home after visiting the shelter, she felt the weight of footsteps behind her. The street was quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. She turned slightly and saw a shadow slip into an alley just as she glanced back. Her heart thudded. She quickened her pace, her phone ready in her hand, but the footsteps didn't return. When she finally reached her apartment, she locked the door and leaned against it, her breath shaky. The city outside kept moving, indifferent to her fear. Marin moved to the window and looked down at the street. A man in a green coat stood under a street lamp across the road, his face hidden in shadow. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned and walked away. Marin's fingers tightened around the phone. She wanted to call Reyes immediately, but something in her held back. A strange mix of dread and resolve settled in her chest. She knew that waiting might mean losing the chance to stop him, but going after him alone could be worse. She sat at her table, opened her notebook, and wrote the date and time, adding, "He's watching now." As she stared at the page, she thought of the girl sleeping safely at the shelter and the boy who had not been found. Her pulse steadied. She wasn't just a witness anymore. She was part of the line drawn between the predator and the next victim. The next morning, Marin went to the shelter early. She found Alina making coffee in the break room. "You're here early," Alina said. "I couldn't sleep," Marin admitted. Alina studied her for a moment. "You look like someone who's about to do something dangerous." Marin gave a faint, tired smile. "Maybe I am. But we can't keep waiting for the next headline." Alina didn't argue. Instead, she handed Marin a steaming mug of coffee. "Then let's be careful together." Marin woke before dawn, her body tight with the kind of alertness that came from too many restless nights. The city outside her window was still asleep. Only the pale glow of street lamps cut across the empty road. She sat at her kitchen table, staring at the notebook that had become her second heartbeat. The latest entry glared back at her. "He's watching now." She sipped cold coffee, trying to quiet the noise in her head. Each line in her notebook felt like a breadcrumb leading into darker woods, but she couldn't stop. If she stopped, someone else would go missing. By sunrise, she was at the shelter. The young girl, whose name was Mia, sat at the breakfast table, her hair sticking up in soft tufts. Marin offered her a small smile. "Did you sleep okay?" Marin asked. Mia nodded, but didn't meet her eyes. "I had a dream," she whispered. "What kind of dream?" Mia hesitated, then said, "He was calling me again. He said I'd be safe if I went with him." A chill slid down Marin's spine. She crouched so she was at eye level with Mia. "You're safe here. You don't have to listen to him," If he ever tries to come near you again, you tell me or the police right away, okay?" Mia nodded, clutching her spoon like a talisman. Alina, watching from the counter, caught Marin's eye and shook her head slightly, a silent question. How long can we keep her safe? Later that day, Marin met with Detective Reyes at the precinct. Reyes spread photographs across the table, grainy security images of the man in the green coat, taken near the shelter and the bus depot. "This is as close as we've gotten," Reyes said. "But no clear shot of his face. We think he's moving around a lot, staying just out of reach. We've had 2 more reports of people approached by someone matching his description, always near bus stops, always at night." Marin studied the photos, her heart pounding. "You think he's planning something else?" Reyes gave a small, tired nod. "Predators like this don't stop on their own. We need to catch him in the act or find solid evidence." Marin's eyes lingered on the photos. She wanted to believe the law would catch up with him. But her instincts whispered that he was clever, always a step ahead. That night, Marin decided to walk home the long way, past the bus depot. The streets were slick with evening rain, the air heavy with the smell of wet asphalt. She kept her hood up and her eyes scanning every corner. She almost missed him at first, a still figure leaning against a lamppost at the far end of the street. Her pulse spiked. The man in the green coat. He seemed to be watching something across the street. Marin followed his gaze and saw a woman waiting alone at the bus stop, scrolling her phone, unaware of the eyes on her. Marin's breath caught. She gripped her phone and debated calling Reyes immediately. But she was terrified that if she called too soon, he would vanish again. She stepped closer, keeping to the shadows. Her heart hammered so hard she could feel it in her throat. The man shifted his weight and began to move toward the bus stop. Marin's fingers fumbled as she hit the call button. The ringing felt unbearably loud in her ear. "Reyes," came the detective's steady voice. "He's here," Marin whispered, her voice trembling. "By the bus depot. He's moving toward a woman at the stop." "Stay back," Reyes said sharply. "I'm sending units now." "Do not approach him." Marin stayed where she was, half hidden in the shadows. But every muscle in her body screamed to move, to do something. The man reached the bus stop and spoke to the woman. Marin couldn't hear the words over the distant hum of traffic, but she saw the woman glance up with a nervous smile, then shake her head. A bus pulled up just then, its brakes screeching. The woman stepped on quickly, disappearing inside. The man in the green coat watched the bus leave, his posture tightening as if something had slipped away from him. Then his head turned slightly, and his gaze swept across the street, landing directly on Marin. Her breath froze. She saw, even from a distance, the small, almost polite smile that curved his mouth. Then he turned and walked into the alley behind the depot, vanishing once again into the shadows. Minutes later, 2 police cars pulled up. Marin gave them a shaky description of what she'd seen, but she could tell by the way they exchanged looks that they were frustrated, always a step behind, just like her. That night, Marin sat in her apartment with her notebook open but blank. The pen in her hand hovered over the page, unwilling to write. She kept seeing the man's smile in her mind, not cruel, not mocking, but calm, as if he knew she couldn't stop him. Alina called to check in. "You need to be careful, Marin," she said. "You can't do this alone." "I know," Marin replied softly, though she wasn't sure she believed it. She looked over at the photograph of the child and the small stuffed rabbit beside it. The two objects felt like silent witnesses, reminders of what was at stake. She finally wrote a single sentence in her notebook before closing it. "He knows I'm watching him now." For the first time, Marin felt that the danger was no longer just out there in the city streets. It was moving toward her, closing the distance. Marin didn't remember falling asleep at her desk, but the sound of her phone vibrating on the wooden surface jolted her awake. Her heart jumped before her eyes even opened. The call was from Detective Reyes. "Marin," his voice came low and urgent. "We have a lead. He reached out to someone online. We traced the IP. It's near the old train yard." She rubbed her face, trying to chase off the heaviness of sleep. Is it real this time? Not just another false alarm? "We're not sure," Reyes admitted, "but it's the best lead we've had. I need you to stay put." "We'll handle it." Marin stared at the dark window. A part of her wanted to let them handle it, to stay safe at home. But another part, the part that had carried her through the long nights and the empty pages, knew she couldn't wait. She had to see for herself. She didn't tell Reyes. She slipped her phone into her pocket, grabbed her coat, and left her apartment. The city felt strange at that hour, neither night nor morning, the streets damp and glistening under orange streetlights. By the time she reached the train yard, dawn was a thin gray line on the horizon. The old buildings stood like hollow shells, their windows broken, graffiti marking the walls. The air smelled of rust and wet earth. Marin moved carefully, her steps soft on the gravel. She clutched her phone in one hand, ready to call for help at the first sign of danger. A soft sound reached her ears, not the distant hum of traffic, but a faint, wavering cry. She followed it, her pulse quickening, until she reached a small outbuilding near the far fence. The door was ajar, creaking slightly in the breeze. Inside, the air was cold and damp. A single flashlight lay on the floor, casting a weak circle of light. Mia was there, huddled in the corner. Her small hands clutched the stuffed rabbit Marin had seen before. "Mia," Marin whispered, relief breaking through her voice. She rushed forward and knelt beside the girl. "I've got you. We're getting out of here." Mia's eyes were wide and wet. "He said you'd come. He said he'd be watching." Marin froze, her head snapping up. A soft laugh, low and unsettling, echoed from the shadows at the far end of the room. The man in the green coat stepped into the dim light. His face, at last, was visible, ordinary, unremarkable, and somehow that made it worse. "You've been very determined," he said calmly. "I almost admire it." Marin stood, placing herself between him and Mia. "It's over," she said. trying to keep her voice steady. "The police are on their way. You can't keep doing this." He tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. "You think I want to hurt them, but I'm saving them. This world doesn't deserve the innocent." Marin's stomach twisted. "You're not saving anyone. You're destroying lives. You don't get to decide who deserves what." His smile was small, almost sad. "You sound like I once did. I thought the world was good once, too. Before I learned the truth." A faint wail of a siren reached them, distant but growing louder. His eyes flicked toward the sound. "I suppose this is where our game ends," he said softly. He turned as if to flee, but Marin stepped forward, her voice sharp. "No more running." For a heartbeat, his expression flickered, not anger, not fear, but something like regret. Then he bolted for the open door. Marin lunged, catching his coat sleeve. They struggled, stumbling into the doorway just as the first police lights swept across the yard. Reyes and 2 officers charged forward, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The man stopped fighting then. He raised his hand slowly, almost serenely, as the officers took him into custody. Marin sank to the ground beside Mia, her chest heaving as adrenaline ebbed. Reyes knelt beside her. "You could have been killed," he said quietly, but there was no anger in his voice, only weary relief. "I couldn't wait," Marin replied, her voice shaking. "I couldn't let him disappear again." Later, as the morning sun rose, Marin sat on the back of an ambulance with Mia wrapped in a blanket beside her. The girl leaned against her, finally asleep. Reyes joined them. "You did good," he said. "You saved her." Marin shook her head. "I just couldn't let another name be written in my notebook." He looked at her, the lines of exhaustion softening for a moment. Sometimes that's all it takes. Someone refusing to give up. Marin glanced at the child sleeping against her shoulder, at the light spilling over the battered train yard. For the first time in a long time, the weight in her chest felt a little lighter, but she also knew the story wasn't over. Evil didn't vanish when one man was caught. It waited in shadows, in broken hearts and twisted minds. As she looked out at the dawn, Marin thought of all the people who had watched this story unfold, who had felt the fear and the hope, who now understood that the psychology of evil wasn't just about monsters in the dark. It was about choices, about the cracks in the human heart. She took a deep breath and said softly, as if to them, "Don't let this be the end. Share what you've seen. Talk about it, learn from it, and never look away when someone needs help. If this story moved you, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment, because the fight against darkness starts with awareness."